Consider, for a moment, the nature of desperation. In the spring of 2015, two brothers sat in yet another conference room, facing yet another panel of executives who would, in all likelihood, reject them once more. Matt and Ross Duffer were unknown, unproven. They had written a film that went nowhere, pitched ideas that died in development, and now they carried with them a concept so audacious it seemed designed for failure. A science fiction horror series set in the 1980s, centered on children, requiring extensive visual effects, and demanding audiences commit to a mythology that wouldn't fully reveal itself for years. They had been rejected by HBO, by Fox, by the networks that shaped American television. And yet here they were again, because desperation, you see, is a remarkable catalyst. It strips away pretense. It forces clarity. When you have nothing left to lose, you begin to see the landscape differently. The landscape they saw was this. The entertainment industry, in 2015, was undergoing a transformation as profound as any in its history. Netflix, once a mail-order DVD service, had become something else entirely, a streaming platform locked in what the press termed the streaming wars. And like all wars, this one created opportunities for the strategically positioned. The Duffer brothers understood something the traditional networks did not. They understood that Netflix was afraid. This fear was not irrational. The company had invested billions in original content, yet struggled to define what made Netflix content distinctly Netflix. They had political dramas, they had comedies, but they lacked the cultural tentpoles that made HBO synonymous with prestige, or that made broadcast networks the center of national conversation. More critically, they needed to capture younger audiences, the millennials and Gen Z viewers who were abandoning traditional television entirely. Imagine witnessing this moment of industrial evolution. The old guard networks with decades of infrastructure and relationships controlled access to living rooms through cable boxes and satellite dishes, but that control was crumbling. Young people no longer waited for Thursday night schedules. They consumed content on laptops, on phones, in fragmented bursts or marathon sessions. The question Netflix faced was existential. How do you compete with institutions when you're building the airplane while flying it? The Duffers had their answer prepared, though it would take the entire pitch meeting to unfold it. Their concept was called Montauk, later to become Stranger Things. On the surface, it appeared simple. Children in a small town encounter supernatural forces, government conspiracies, parallel dimensions, a monster that hunts in the darkness. But the true genius lay not in what the show was about, but in how it was architected for the exact moment in which it would emerge. Consider the strategic precision at work here. The Duffer brothers proposed setting their series in 1983, the height of what we now call the Amblin era, when Steven Spielberg's production company defined a generation's sense of wonder and adventure. E.T., The Goonies, Poltergeist. These films lived in the collective memory of millennials, who in 2015 were entering their prime earning years, the exact demographic advertisers coveted and streaming platforms desperately needed. But nostalgia alone is cheap fuel. It burns bright and fast, leaving nothing behind. The Duffers understood this. They weren't simply recreating the 1980s, they were weaponizing it. Every synth note in their proposed soundtrack, every poster on a bedroom wall, every bit of costume design would serve as a Pavlovian trigger, activating memories in millennial viewers while seeming fresh and exotic to younger audiences who had never experienced that decade firsthand. The pitch continued. 8 episodes. Not the traditional 22 of network television, which would have diluted the narrative and exploded the budget. 8 tightly constructed hours that audiences could consume in a weekend, perfect for the binge culture Netflix was pioneering. Each episode would end with the kind of cliffhanger that made the next episode button irresistible. The show was designed, quite deliberately, as a viewing trap, and the budget here was where the Duffers revealed their understanding of power dynamics. They proposed a lean budget compared to prestige cable. No sprawling cast of established stars demanding millions per episode. No exotic location shoots. One small town. One modest soundstage dressed as the Upside Down. A core cast of children who could be hired for scale, locked into contracts for multiple seasons before they possessed the leverage that comes with fame. This was the calculation that made Netflix executives lean forward in their chairs. The Duffers were offering them something rare, a high-concept series that could generate cultural conversation without the financial exposure of a Game of Thrones or House of Cards. If it failed, the loss would be manageable. If it succeeded, they would own years of one of television's most valuable properties, with cast contracts signed before anyone knew the show's worth. But there was one more element to the pitch, perhaps the most crucial: casting. The Duffers proposed hiring unknown child actors for the core ensemble. In Hollywood, where star power traditionally opens wallets, this seemed counterintuitive, but reflect on the logic for a moment. Unknown children cost almost nothing. They could be molded to the roles rather than having roles adapted to accommodate their personas. Most importantly, they could be contracted for multiple seasons at rates that would seem laughable once the show became a phenomenon. Yet the Duffers also understood the need for bridges actors who could connect different audience segments. For this, they proposed Winona Ryder. The selection of Ryder was strategic brilliance disguised as nostalgia. She had starred in Beetlejuice, Edward Scissorhands, and Reality Bites films that defined the adolescence of Generation X. She was recognizable enough to give the show credibility, but not so expensive that she would strain the budget. Her career had cooled from its 90s peak, which meant her representatives would be receptive to a television series that mainstream thinking still considered a step down from film. And critically, her presence in promotional materials would signal to millennial audiences that this show understood their cultural reference points. The pitch meeting ended. The Duffers left the conference room uncertain, as they had left so many conference rooms before. But this time, something was different. This time, they had correctly read the moment. Netflix was not simply looking for good television. They were looking for ammunition in an arms race. They needed content that would generate headlines, that would trend on social media, that would give subscribers a reason to maintain their monthly payments. They needed water cooler moments in an era when water coolers had been replaced by Twitter feeds. 3 months later, the Duffers received their answer. Netflix had greenlit Stranger Things for an 8-episode first season. The brothers had played their hand perfectly, but they made one more move that would prove decisive in the years to come. They negotiated for creative control. In Hollywood's traditional model, studios maintained oversight of their investments. They could demand script changes, casting choices, even final cut. The Duffers took Netflix's smaller initial budget, smaller than they might have commanded elsewhere, in exchange for minimal interference. Netflix would fund the show, but the Duffers would control its creative destiny. This was the ultimate power play, though it wouldn't be recognized as such until much later. The Duffers had read the landscape and understood that Netflix, desperate to establish itself as a creator-friendly platform, would accept this arrangement. They were gambling that their vision was sound, that they could deliver what they'd promised without studio safety nets. Production began in November 2015 in Atlanta, Georgia. The city offered tax incentives that stretched the budget, and its relatively mild climate allowed year-round shooting. The downtown area could be dressed to look like small-town Indiana. Warehouses could be transformed into laboratories and alternative dimensions. The casting process unfolded exactly as planned. Hundreds of children auditioned for the core roles. The Duffers weren't looking for experienced actors, they were looking for authentic chemistry, for young people who could embody the genuine friendships the script demanded. They found Finn Wolfhard, Gaten Matarazzo, Caleb McLaughlin, and Noah Schnapp. None were household names, all were affordable. And then there was Millie Bobby Brown. The role of Eleven, the mysterious girl with psychokinetic powers, required someone who could convey depth without dialogue, who could be simultaneously terrifying and vulnerable, alien and human. Brown was 12 years old, nearly unknown, and absolutely perfect. Her audition tape showed a young actor with an intuitive understanding of stillness, of how silence could communicate more than words. The Duffers cast her immediately. They also made sure her contract locked her in for multiple seasons at a rate that would soon seem absurdly low. By early 2016, production was complete. Netflix scheduled the release for July 15, 2016 midsummer, when traditional television aired reruns and cable networks dumped their weakest programming. The date seemed to confirm Netflix's lack of confidence in the project. In reality, it was a strategic strike against an undefended position. The summer television landscape was a graveyard. Audiences had been trained for decades to expect nothing of value between May sweeps and September premieres. Netflix saw an opportunity to own a season that no one else wanted. With no competition for attention, Stranger Things could dominate the conversation during a media dead zone. The Duffers had done their part. They had crafted 8 hours of television that balanced horror and heart, that earned its scares while making audiences care deeply about the characters facing those terrors. They had delivered exactly what they'd promised. E.T. meets Stephen King. The Goonies meets John Carpenter, all filtered through the mythology of Dungeons and Dragons. Now came the test. Would audiences discover it? Would critics champion it? Or would it disappear into Netflix's growing library of content, watched by few and remembered by fewer? On July 15, 2016, at midnight Pacific time, all 8 episodes of Stranger Things appeared on Netflix's platform simultaneously. There was no red carpet premiere, no primetime launch event. The show simply existed, waiting to be found. The Duffer Brothers had positioned every piece perfectly. They had timed their pitch to intersect with Netflix's moment of maximum desperation. They had packaged nostalgia when millennials possessed peak cultural influence and purchasing power. They had structured their narrative for binge consumption. They had cast unknown talents who couldn't demand star salaries. They had secured creative control while keeping costs manageable. All the strategic advantages were in place. But strategy, no matter how brilliant, cannot guarantee cultural lightning will strike. That requires something less calculable, the mysterious alchemy that transforms a television show into a phenomenon. The brothers waited. The executives at Netflix waited. And in living rooms and bedrooms across America, and eventually the world, viewers began to press play on a show about children confronting monsters in a small town in Indiana, unaware they were about to participate in something that would reshape the entertainment landscape. The Duffers had made their pitch. They had won their gamble with Netflix. They had executed their power play with precision. Now came the moment of truth. Would the audience complete the equation? Would the viewing public transform their carefully architected series into the phenomenon Netflix desperately needed? The answer would arrive not in days or weeks, but in hours. And when it came, it would exceed every projection, every hope, every strategic calculation the Duffers had made. But that transformation from obscure Netflix release to cultural juggernaut, that story belongs to what came next. To the viral wildfire that would consume social media, to the unexpected martyrdom of a minor character named Barb, to the moment when the Duffers realized they had not simply created a successful show, but had fundamentally altered the balance of power in the streaming wars. Consider how fragile it all seemed in those final hours before release. 2 unknown brothers, betting everything on a vision that had been rejected by every traditional powerhouse. A streaming platform desperate to prove it belonged in the conversation. Unknown child actors whose lives were about to change forever. A show set in the past, released in the dead of summer, given no traditional promotion. And yet, in that fragility lived possibility. In that desperation lived clarity. In that calculated gambit lived the future of entertainment. The pitch had been made. The power play had been executed. Now came the conquest. The first viewers began their journey at 3 a.m, Eastern Time. Insomniacs, night shift workers, teenagers who had stayed up past reasonable hours. They pressed play on episode 1, intending perhaps to watch a single episode before sleep. They did not sleep. By dawn, the first wave had finished all 8 episodes. By noon, they had begun posting on social media. By evening, the algorithm had noticed something unusual. A Netflix show was generating conversation at a velocity typically reserved for network finales or major sporting events. What happened next was not planned, could not have been planned, yet represented the perfect collision of content and cultural moment. Stranger Things had been engineered for binge consumption, structured for social media amplification, and released into a media vacuum that magnified every mention. But engineering can only create conditions. What unfolded was something more organic, more powerful, more transformative than strategic planning could account for. It was a wildfire, and wildfires, once ignited, follow their own logic. Consider the mathematics of viral spread. Traditional television operated on appointment viewing. Everyone watched the same episode on the same night, discussed it the next day, then waited a week for the next installment. Netflix's model inverted this entirely. By releasing all episodes simultaneously, they created a viewing environment where audiences moved at different speeds through the narrative. Some finished in a day, others took a week. This staggered consumption meant the conversation never peaked, and died it sustained, it built, it compounded. The Duffers had structured each episode to end with revelations that demanded discussion. Where is Will Byers? What is the Upside Down? Who is 11? What are her powers? Each question spawned theories, debate, analysis. And because viewers could immediately watch the next episode, they became evangelists, returning to social media after each new discovery to pull others into the experience. But there was something else at work here, something the Duffers could not have predicted. Her name was Barbara Holland. Barb. In the writer's room, Barb was a minor character, the best friend who provides contrast to the protagonist, who disappears early to raise stakes, who exists primarily to be mourned. Shannon Purser, the actress who played her, had filmed her scenes expecting to be forgotten, a footnote in someone else's story. The audience decided otherwise. Barb became a phenomenon within the phenomenon. Her disappearance and death, largely unnoticed by the characters, overshadowed by the search for Will, struck a chord with viewers who saw in her something profound. She was the outsider, the uncool friend, the one left behind when the popular crowd moved forward. Her fate became a rallying cry. Justice for Barb. The hashtag trended worldwide. Reflect on the unexpected power of this moment. The Duffers had crafted a show about outcasts and misfits finding power in their difference. Barb's death inadvertently became the ultimate expression of that theme. Millions of viewers, many of them people who had felt overlooked or abandoned in their own lives, claimed her as their own. They created fan art, wrote essays, demanded the show, acknowledge her importance. Netflix's marketing team watched in amazement as audiences did their work for them. Barb memes circulated by the thousands. News outlets ran articles analyzing the cultural significance of her character. Television critics wrote think pieces about why her death resonated so deeply. The conversation expanded beyond Stranger Things itself to larger questions about how media treats its supporting characters, its women, its non-stereotypically attractive figures. This was marketing that money could not buy. This was organic cultural conversation, and it was worth millions in publicity. But Barb was only one element of the viral explosion. Consider Eleven herself. The Duffers had made a calculated gamble with her character design. They shaved Millie Bobby Brown's head, a striking visual choice that eliminated the traditional markers of young female beauty. They gave her minimal dialogue, forcing Brown to communicate through physicality and expression. They dressed her in a pink dress and men's clothes, making her simultaneously vulnerable and powerful, feminine and beyond gender. This design created instantly recognizable iconography. Eleven's image could be shared, replicated, cosplayed. Her shaved head became a symbol. Her bloody nose, the physical cost of using her powers, became shorthand for sacrifice and strength. The image of her emerging from the forest in Mike's too large clothes became one of the most gift moments of the year. Every choice amplified her mimetic potential. When she used her powers to flip a van, that clip circulated endlessly. When she demolished the Demogorgon in the final episode, that moment became event television despite airing on a platform without traditional event scheduling. Viewers shared these scenes not as intellectual exercises, but as emotional experiences they needed others to witness. The show's 8-episode structure proved perfectly calibrated for the attention economy, long enough to build genuine investment in characters and mythology, short enough to be conquered in a weekend. This hit what we might call the commitment sweet spot, long enough to feel substantial, short enough to not feel intimidating. Viewers could recommend it to friends knowing they were asking for roughly 8 hours, not the 100+ hours required for a traditional network drama. And because Netflix had released it in July, during television's dormant season, Stranger Things faced no competition for the cultural conversation. No prestige dramas were airing their finales. No major network events competed for attention. The show owned the moment simply because it was the only thing happening. The Duffers watched the metrics roll in with a mixture of elation and disbelief. Within 4 days, the show had been viewed in millions of households. Within 2 weeks, it had become Netflix's most watched original series. By August, it had entered the broader cultural lexicon. References appeared in other shows, in late-night comedy, in everyday conversation. But perhaps more significantly, the show's success was generating a different kind of power and negotiating leverage. Consider what had changed in just a few weeks. Finn Wolfhard, Millie Bobby Brown, Gaten Matarazzo, Caleb McLaughlin, and Noah Schnapp had been unknown children when they signed their contracts. Now they were recognizable faces attached to a cultural phenomenon. Their representatives, agents, and managers who had negotiated initial contracts at standard child actor rates now possessed something valuable. Clients that Netflix desperately needed to keep happy. The streaming wars were intensifying. Amazon was investing in original content. Hulu was expanding its offerings. Traditional networks were launching their own streaming platforms. In this environment, Stranger Things represented something Netflix could not afford to lose: a proven hit that drove subscriptions and defined the platform's brand identity. The child actors' contracts locked them in for multiple seasons, yes, but contracts can be renegotiated when the alternative is public relations disasters or fractured casts. The actors now had leverage, and their representatives knew it. More immediately, Netflix faced a decision about Season 2. The standard approach would be to wait for complete viewership data, analyze the demographics, calculate return on investment, then cautiously greenlight a second season. But the streaming wars did not permit caution. If Netflix hesitated, they risked losing momentum. Worse, they risked competitors poaching the Duffers for their own 80s nostalgia projects. On August 31st, 2016, just 47 days after the show's release, Netflix announced that Stranger Things had been renewed for a second season. This was not merely a renewal, this was a declaration of commitment, a signal to investors and subscribers that Netflix had found one of its tentpole properties, The Duffers had structured their pitch around providing value to Netflix. Now, they were receiving value in return, the security of knowing their vision would continue, the validation of massive success, and the increasingly rare commodity of creative autonomy. But success creates its own pressures. The show's unexpected triumph meant Season 2 would arrive with impossible expectations. The Duffers would need to recapture the magic while avoiding the sophomore slump that had killed so many promising series. They would need to expand the mythology without losing narrative focus. They would need to introduce new elements while honoring what made Season 1 special. And they would need to do all of this while navigating the new power dynamics their success had created. The viral spread of Season 1 had demonstrated something profound about the changing media landscape. Traditional television's power had rested on scarcity, limited channels, limited time slots, limited access. Netflix's power rested on abundance, unlimited content, available always, consumed on viewer terms. But abundance creates its own challenge. How do you make any single piece of content matter when everything is available all the time? Stranger Things had solved this problem through a combination of quality, timing, and cultural resonance. The show was genuinely excellent, released when nothing else competed for attention, and tapped into emotional needs that transcended mere nostalgia. It made people feel something: wonder, fear, heartbreak, joy, and in the attention economy, emotional resonance is the ultimate currency. The fan theories multiplied in the months following Season 1's release. Was Eleven dead or alive? Would the Upside Down return? What secrets remained in Hawkins' laboratory? These questions kept the show alive in the cultural conversation, even as other content competed for attention. The Duffers had structured their finale to provide closure while opening new mysteries, extending the show's viral half-life far beyond its initial viewing window. Netflix's competitors watched and learned. The traditional weekly release schedule, designed for an era of appointment television, suddenly seemed antiquated. Why make audiences wait when they could consume content on their own timeline? But the lesson went deeper than release strategy. Stranger Things proved that streaming platforms could create cultural moments rivaling traditional television, that the future of entertainment would be built on shows that generated conversation, not just views. The advertising industry noticed as well. Stranger Things had featured Eggo waffles prominently in Season 1 Eleven's favorite food, established as a running joke and emotional touchstone. Kellogg's had not paid for this placement. The Duffers had simply chosen Eggo as shorthand for childhood comfort food. But when the show became a phenomenon, Eggo sales increased. Suddenly brands were approaching Netflix asking how they could be integrated into future seasons. This represented a fundamental shift in product placement dynamics. Traditionally, brands paid to appear in content. Now successful content was so valuable that brands would pay premium rates for authentic integration. The Duffers and Netflix suddenly controlled access to one of entertainment's most valuable properties, and every brand wanted in. The summer of 2016 became known in entertainment circles as the summer Stranger Things changed everything. It proved streaming could generate appointment television's communal experience through different mechanisms. It demonstrated that unknown actors could become stars overnight in the attention economy. It showed that 8 episodes could be more valuable than 22, and it confirmed that Netflix, once dismissed as a DVD by mail service, had evolved into something else entirely, a studio that could create and control cultural phenomena. But wildfires, once started, must be fed. The audience that had discovered Stranger Things with such enthusiasm would return for Season 2 with expectations the Duffers would struggle to meet. The child actors, locked into contracts negotiated when they were unknown, would grow increasingly aware of their market value. Netflix would pressure for faster production timelines to maintain momentum, and the streaming wars would intensify, with every platform seeking its own Stranger Things. The viral moment had passed, the market had been captured, Now came the harder work, sustaining success, managing growth, navigating the treacherous politics of heightened expectations. The Duffers returned to the writer's room to begin crafting Season 2, aware that they were no longer creating in obscurity. Millions would watch. Critics would scrutinize every choice. The child actors would arrive on set as recognizable celebrities rather than anonymous newcomers. The budget would be larger, the resources greater, but so too would the pressure. In those early planning sessions, they made several key decisions that would shape the show's future. They would set Season 2 1 year after Season 1, allowing the actors' natural aging to align with their characters. They would introduce new characters to refresh the formula without abandoning the core ensemble. They would expand the mythology of the Upside Down while keeping the emotional focus on the relationships audiences had come to love. And they would create an episode, Episode 7, eventually titled The Lost Sister, that would attempt something ambitious and risky. A standalone story following 11, separate from the main narrative, designed partly as a backdoor pilot for potential spin-offs. This last decision would prove controversial, but it revealed the Duffers' strategic thinking. They were not simply making a television show anymore. They were building a franchise, an intellectual property that could sustain multiple storylines, generate merchandising revenue, and extend far beyond the original 8 episodes they had pitched in that conference room in 2015. The viral warfare of Season 1 had been won. Netflix had captured the market position they desperately needed. The Duffers had gone from unknown writers to showrunners of a cultural phenomenon. The child actors had transformed from obscure talents to recognizable stars. But in victory lay the seeds of new challenges. The power dynamics had shifted. The stakes had escalated. The entire entertainment industry was watching to see if Stranger Things could sustain what it had so spectacularly achieved. The wildfire had consumed the dry tinder of summer television. Now it would need to prove it could burn through more difficult terrain, the crowded fall schedule, the intensifying competition, the impossible burden of following perfection with something equally compelling. On October 27th, 2017, Season 2 would premiere. Between the triumph of Season 1 and the test of Season 2 lay 15 months of negotiation, creation, and calculation. 15 months of navigating success's treacherous waters. 15 months of discovering that creating a phenomenon is difficult, but sustaining one is infinitely harder. The viral moment had passed. The real work was beginning. Success, in nature, creates its own ecosystem of pressures. The Duffers returned to Atlanta in the spring of 2017 to begin production on Season 2, and everything had changed. The sound stages were the same. The streets of the city still doubled convincingly for Hawkins, Indiana, but the young actors arriving on set were no longer anonymous children. They were recognizable celebrities, with social media followings in the millions, with magazine covers and talk show appearances behind them, with representatives who understood exactly how valuable their clients had become. Consider what happens when a system experiences rapid success. Equilibrium shatters, new forces emerge. What worked in obscurity must be recalibrated for visibility. The Duffers faced a challenge that has destroyed countless promising series. How do you follow perfection without simply repeating it? Season 1 had been lightning in a bottle, unexpected, organic, culturally resonant. Season 2 would arrive with the weight of 15 months of anticipation, with millions of fans ready to scrutinize every frame, with critics prepared to declare it either a worthy successor or a disappointing sequel. The creative freedom that comes with anonymity had evaporated. Now, every choice would be analyzed, debated, measured against an impossible standard. The brothers made their first defensive maneuver in the writer's room. They would expand the world of Hawkins while keeping the emotional core intact. This meant introducing new characters who could refresh the formula without alienating the audience that had fallen in love with the original ensemble. Enter Max Mayfield and her stepbrother Billy Hargrove. Max was strategic calculation disguised as character development. A new girl in town, a skilled arcade gamer, someone who could disrupt the established dynamics of the core group without replacing anyone. She would create romantic tension, yes, but more importantly, she would represent the future new blood that could carry the show forward as the original cast inevitably aged out or moved on to other projects. Billy was something else entirely, a calculated risk designed to inject danger and sexual tension into a show that had largely avoided both. Dacre Montgomery brought to the role a threatening physicality, a volatility that made him compelling and disturbing in equal measure. He represented the darkness that could exist in ordinary suburban life, the monster that walked in human form rather than emerging from parallel dimensions. But these additions carried risk. Fans who had bonded with the original group might resent newcomers. The chemistry that had made Season 1 special might be diluted by expanding the ensemble. The Duffers were gambling that their audience trusted them enough to accept evolution. Netflix, meanwhile, faced its own calculations. Season 1's success had been organic and unexpected. Season 2 required a marketing campaign that could capitalize on that success, without making the show feel corporate and manufactured. They increased the budget significantly. The reported per-episode cost jumped to approximately $8 million from Season 1's $6 million. This allowed for more elaborate set pieces, better visual effects, and the resources to deliver spectacle that matched audience expectations. But money creates its own pressures. With greater investment comes greater scrutiny. Netflix executives, emboldened by Season 1's success, began offering suggestions, notes, opinions on creative direction. The Duffers' hard-won creative autonomy faced its first serious test. How much input could they accept before the show ceased to be their vision? How much could they resist before Netflix began questioning whether they could handle the responsibility of their own creation? The production timeline itself became a negotiation. Netflix wanted Season 2 quickly to maintain momentum. The Duffers wanted time to ensure quality. The compromise 15 months between seasons satisfied neither party completely, but represented the reality of television production in the streaming era. Unlike network television with its rigid annual schedule, streaming allowed flexibility, but flexibility created its own challenges. How long could you wait between seasons before audiences moved on to the next phenomenon? The young actors arrived on set noticeably changed. Finn Wolfhard, Millie Bobby Brown, Gaten Matarazzo, Caleb McLaughlin, and Noah Schnapp had grown physically as children do, but also in confidence and awareness of their own value. Their representatives had begun the delicate process of renegotiating contracts, leveraging the actors' newfound fame against Netflix's desperate need to keep the cast intact. These negotiations happened largely behind closed doors, but their impact rippled through production. The young actors were no longer simply grateful for the opportunity, they understood they were essential to a multi-million-dollar enterprise. This was not greed or ego, but simple market reality. Netflix had invested heavily in Stranger Things. The show could not continue without its core cast. Therefore, the core cast possessed leverage. The streaming wars had intensified since Season 1's premiere. Amazon had increased its content budget dramatically. Hulu was producing prestigious original series. Traditional networks were launching streaming platforms and courting showrunners with promises of creative freedom and substantial budgets. In this environment, Netflix could not afford to lose Stranger Things or the Duffer Brothers. This dependency became leverage that would reshape the economics of the entire production. The Duffers made another strategic decision that would prove controversial. They would create Episode 7, The Lost Sister, as a standalone story following Eleven's journey to Chicago to find another test subject from Hawkins' laboratory. This episode would break from the main narrative entirely, focusing solely on Eleven's character development and her struggle with identity and belonging. The decision had multiple motivations. Creatively, it allowed exploration of Eleven's inner world. Strategically, it served as a backdoor pilot, a proof of concept that the Stranger Things universe could sustain spin-off series set in different locations with different characters. Netflix was beginning to think beyond individual shows to cinematic universes, following the model that had made Marvel billions for Disney. If Stranger Things could spawn spin-offs, the intellectual property's value multiplied exponentially. But there was another element at work. Bob Newby, played by Sean Astin. The casting of Astin exemplified the Duffers' understanding of nostalgia's mechanics. Astin had starred in The Goonies, one of the foundational films of 80s childhood, and had achieved renewed fame as Samwise Gamgee in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. His face carried with it decades of accumulated goodwill. Audiences trusted him instinctively because he embodied heroism and loyalty in their cultural memory. The Duffers cast him as Joyce Byers' new boyfriend, a gentle electronics store manager whose earnest kindness contrasted sharply with the show's darker elements. Bob represented normalcy, safety, the possibility of healing after trauma, and precisely because audiences loved him, because his presence felt comforting and right, his death would devastate them. This was calculation at its most precise. The Duffers needed Season 2 to have real stakes, genuine danger. Will Byers' possession by the Mind Flayer raised those stakes conceptually, but audiences needed to feel loss tangibly. Bob's death, heroic, tragic, ultimately futile, would provide that emotional gut punch. It would remind viewers that in Hawkins, even the good, kind, brave characters could die. No one was safe. Sean Astin understood his role in this equation. In interviews, he spoke about being honored to play a character who mattered, who would be remembered. He did not mention that he had been cast specifically to be mourned, that his nostalgic capital was being converted into emotional currency, but he must have known. In Hollywood, everyone understands the transaction. Production progressed through the summer of 2017. The expanded budget showed on screen the effects were more sophisticated, the set pieces more elaborate. The Upside Down felt more realized, more tangibly dangerous. The Mind Flayer, a massive shadowy entity that possessed Will and sought to spread its influence into the real world, represented an escalation from Season 1's relatively contained threat. But escalation creates its own trap. If each season must raise stakes higher, eventually you reach unsustainable levels of danger. How many times can Hawkins be threatened before the premise strains credibility? How many government conspiracies can exist in one small town? These were questions the Duffers would need to answer, but not yet. Season 2 still operated within believable parameters. The emotional stakes mattered more than the supernatural ones, and here the Duffers demonstrated their understanding of what had made Season 1 resonate. The show was not primarily about monsters, it was about friendship, family, belonging, and the courage required to protect what you love. Will's possession put his mother, brother, and friends in the position of fighting for his soul. Mike's desperate attempts to reconnect with Eleven drove the season's emotional arc. Steve Harrington's evolution from cliché jock to surrogate older brother provided surprising depth and warmth. This last element, Steve's character development, represented another strategic success. Joe Keery had been cast as a relatively one-dimensional character in Season 1, the popular kid who would presumably serve as antagonist or comic relief. But Keery brought unexpected depth to the role, and the Duffers, reading audience response, leaned into it. Steve's friendship with Dustin, his protective instincts toward the younger kids, his ability to grow beyond his initial limitations. All of this made him one of Season 2's breakout characters. This adaptability, the willingness to follow what worked rather than rigidly adhering to initial plans, would serve the Duffers well. Television series evolve organically. Actors bring unexpected dimensions to roles. Audience response highlights what resonates. The best showrunners learn to read these signals and adjust accordingly. As post-production wrapped in early fall, Netflix made its marketing calculations. Season 2 would premiere on October 27, 2017, strategically placed to dominate Halloween weekend and capture the audience's appetite for horror-tinged entertainment. The date also positioned the show to carry Netflix through the critical fourth quarter, when subscriber growth traditionally slowed and competitors launched their most aggressive campaigns. The promotional campaign was substantially larger than Season 1's. Billboards appeared in major cities, television commercials ran during prime time. The cast appeared on talk shows and magazine covers. Netflix hosted elaborate premiere events. This was no longer a hidden gem waiting to be discovered. It was a major cultural event, marketed with the resources of a summer blockbuster. But such visibility creates vulnerability. The surprise was gone. Critics and audiences would approach Season 2 with expectations rather than open minds. The Duffers could not rely on word of mouth to build slowly. They would face immediate judgment from millions of viewers in the first weekend. They had done everything they could. They had expanded the world carefully, introducing new characters while honoring the originals. They had raised stakes without losing emotional grounding. They had delivered visual spectacle while maintaining the intimate character moments that made Season 1 special. They had killed Bob Newby to prove danger was real. They had created the controversial Lost Sister episode to test franchise expansion possibilities. Now came the verdict. Season 2 premiered globally on October 27th at midnight Pacific Time. Within hours, social media erupted with reactions. The response was complicated. Most viewers loved the season. The ratings were enormous. Viewership exceeded Season 1 significantly. But there were criticisms. Some felt the pacing lagged in. The middle episodes. Others found Billy too one-dimensional as a villain. And the Lost Sister episode, the Duffers' backdoor pilot experiment, drew particularly harsh criticism. Many viewers felt it broke the narrative momentum just as the season was building to its climax. This critical reception revealed a fundamental tension in the streaming model. When all episodes released simultaneously, viewers experienced the season as a whole. An experimental episode that might have been interesting in weekly installments felt like a jarring interruption when binged. The Duffers had structured Season 2 for binge viewing but hadn't fully accounted for how that structure would affect pacing and tolerance for detours. Yet despite these criticisms, Season 2 succeeded in its essential mission. It proved Stranger Things was not a fluke. The show could sustain success across multiple seasons. The young cast could carry increasingly complex storylines. The mythology could deepen without collapsing into confusion. And most critically, audiences remained invested. They cared about these characters, this town, this ongoing story. Netflix's internal metrics told the full story. Season 2 drove substantial new subscriptions and significantly reduced churn. The show remained the platform's most valuable property. International viewership had grown dramatically, proving Stranger Things transcended American nostalgia to access something more universal. The licensing deals multiplied merchandise, video games, theme park attractions. What had begun as an 8-episode gamble had evolved into a multimedia franchise. The young actors' representatives returned to negotiation tables, armed with new data. Their clients had proven they could deliver sustained success. The contracts signed when they were unknown children now looked absurdly undervalued. Netflix faced a choice: renegotiate substantial salary increases or risk public relations disasters if the cast felt exploited. They chose renegotiation. The exact figures remained confidential, but industry observers estimated the young leads received raises of 300 to 400% for future seasons. The Duffers themselves received new deals, a substantial overall agreement that secured their services for future seasons and gave Netflix first-look rights to any other projects they might develop. They had proven themselves not just as writers who could craft a single compelling season, but as showrunners who could manage a major production, navigate network politics, and sustain quality across multiple installments. Season 2's success solidified Stranger Things' position as Netflix's crown jewel, the show the platform would point to when arguing it belonged in conversations about prestige television. But success also locked everyone into a machine that would demand more episodes, more spectacle, more escalation. The defensive maneuvers of Season 2 had worked. The expansion had succeeded without destroying what made the show special. But the true test still lay ahead. Season 3 would need to go bigger still, to find new ways to surprise audiences who now expected brilliance. The stakes would escalate further, the budgets would balloon, and the power dynamics between actors and studio, between creators and executives, between artistic vision and commercial pressure would grow increasingly complex. The Duffers had navigated the treacherous sophomore season successfully. They had introduced new characters, expanded the mythology, delivered emotional gut punches, and maintained the core of what made Season 1 special. They had made strategic choices, some more successful than others, but had emerged with their vision intact and their position strengthened. The expansion was complete. The defensive maneuvers had held. Now came the moment of maximum ambition, the season that would push every boundary, command every resource, and definitively prove whether Stranger Things was merely excellent television or something more, a cultural force that could reshape the entertainment landscape itself. There are moments in any enterprise when all forces align, when resources, timing, cultural relevance, and execution converge to create something that transcends the sum of its parts. For Stranger Things, that moment arrived in the summer of 2019. Season 3 represented the show at the apex of its power. The Duffers commanded unprecedented creative control. Netflix had committed resources that would have seemed fantastical during that initial pitch meeting 4 years earlier. The young cast had evolved from unknowns into bankable stars whose presence guaranteed attention, and perhaps most critically, the show had become more than entertainment. It had become an economic instrument, a weapon in the streaming wars that Netflix wielded with increasing sophistication. Consider the strategic timing of Season 3's release. Netflix scheduled the premiere for July 4th, 2019, Independence Day, the heart of summer, traditionally the weakest quarter for streaming subscriptions, as people spent time outdoors and on vacation. This apparent contradiction revealed deeper calculation. Netflix knew its second quarter subscriber growth had disappointed investors. They needed a third quarter catalyst, something that would drive new subscriptions and reduce cancellations precisely when their metrics looked most vulnerable. Stranger Things was that catalyst, but to function as such, it needed to be more than merely good. It needed to be event television. The kind of cultural moment that makes subscriptions feel mandatory rather than optional. The Duffers had planned accordingly. Season 3 would be the most ambitious production yet, with a reported budget of $120 million for 8 episodes, $15 million per episode, 2.5 times Season 1's budget. This was not indulgence. This was a statement. Netflix was declaring that streaming content could match or exceed theatrical production values, that the distinction between cinema and television had collapsed. But where would those resources go? How do you spend $15 million per episode in a show set in a small Indiana town? The answer was Starcourt Mall. The Duffers made a decision that exemplified their understanding of both nostalgia and pragmatism. They would construct a functioning 1980s shopping mall, not just facades or small sets, but an entire operational complex with dozens of stores, a food court, a cinema, even an ice cream parlor where Steve and a new character named Robin would work. The construction took months and cost millions. It was the largest set ever built for a television production. This investment served multiple purposes simultaneously. Narratively, the mall provided a central location where all storylines could converge. Thematically, it represented Reagan-era capitalism's seductive promise: consumption as identity, shopping as leisure, the mall as the new town square. Visually, it offered endless opportunities for colorful, dynamic sequences that would look spectacular on screen. But there was another purpose, one that revealed how thoroughly the Duffers and Netflix had integrated creative vision with commercial strategy: product placement. The mall was not simply decorated with period-appropriate brands. It was a carefully curated gallery of companies willing to pay substantial fees for authentic integration into the show's universe. Coca-Cola became a plot point. The Duffers wrote an entire conspiracy around New Coke's introduction in the summer of 1985. Burger King locations appeared prominently. The Gap, Jazzercise, dozens of other brands paid to be part of Stranger Things' vision of the 80s. This represented a fundamental evolution in how television content was financed. Traditionally, product placement was obvious and intrusive, breaking viewer immersion. The Duffers had figured out how to make it feel organic, even nostalgic. Audiences didn't resent seeing Coca-Cola or Burger King because those brands were authentically part of the 80s experience. The integration felt like world-building rather than advertising. The result was a revenue stream worth tens of millions of dollars, money that effectively reduced Netflix's net investment while increasing the show's production value. It was financial alchemy, converting brand partnerships into both funding and authenticity. But the mall served yet another purpose, perhaps the most crucial. It gave the cast something magnificent to work within. By season 3, the young actors had become highly skilled performers. Finn Wolfhard, Millie Bobby Brown, Gaten Matarazzo, Caleb McLaughlin, Noah Schnapp, and newcomer Sadie Sink, who had joined as Max in season 2, had grown from talented children into confident young actors capable of carrying complex material. The mall's scale and detail gave them an environment worthy of their abilities. Consider what the Duffers understood about their actors' trajectories. These young people were aging naturally, inevitably. Within a year or two, they would no longer convincingly play middle schoolers. The show needed to evolve with them, or risk the awkwardness that had plagued other coming-of-age series. Season 3 aged the characters up appropriately. They were entering high school, experiencing first relationships, confronting the reality that childhood friendships might not survive the transition to adolescence. This created emotional stakes that matched the supernatural ones. Yes, a Soviet conspiracy threatened Hawkins. Yes, the Mind Flayer sought to break through from the Upside Down. But the real threat was simpler and more universal. Growing up, growing apart, losing the magic that had made childhood friendships feel eternal. The Duffers wrote this emotional reality into the fabric of season 3. Mike and Eleven navigated their first romantic relationship, with all its awkward intensity. Will struggled with being left behind, as his friends pursued interests beyond Dungeons and Dragons. Lucas and Max cycled through breakups and reconciliations with teenage volatility. Dustin returned from summer camp with a girlfriend his friends suspected was imaginary. And Steve, now graduated from high school and working at an ice cream parlor, faced the reality that his glory days were behind him at 19. His friendship with Robin, a new character who became an instant fan favorite, provided some of season 3's most genuine moments, culminating in Steve's acceptance of Robin's sexuality in a bathroom scene that balanced humor, heart, and representation with remarkable grace. These character moments mattered more than the spectacle, though the spectacle was considerable. The Duffers had learned from season 2's criticisms. They would not sacrifice pacing for experimentation. Every episode would drive relentlessly forward, building tension until the explosive finale at Starcourt Mall, where multiple storylines would converge in chaos and heroism and loss. That finale required careful calibration. The Duffers needed casualties that would raise stakes for season 4 without gutting the core ensemble. They decided Hopper would die or appear to die, a distinction that would matter later. David Harbour's performance as Hawkins' gruff but devoted police chief had made Hopper one of the show's emotional anchors. His sacrifice to close the gate between worlds provided the season's devastating emotional climax. But there was calculation here, beyond storytelling. Harbour had become an increasingly expensive cast member as his star rose. His death provided budget flexibility. If negotiations for future seasons became difficult, the show could continue without him. If terms could be reached, his return from apparent death could generate enormous buzz. The Duffers had created a strategic option, wrapped in narrative necessity. They made another significant decision. The Byers family would leave Hawkins. Joyce, Will, Jonathan, and the newly adopted 11 would move to California, separating major characters from the show's central location. This served multiple purposes. It allowed exploration of new settings in future seasons. It provided breathing room in what had become a crowded ensemble, and it created flexibility for cast negotiations. Actors who wanted reduced roles or schedule accommodations could be written around more easily. But these strategic decisions would only matter if Season 3 succeeded. And success, in the summer of 2019, required more than good storytelling. It required Netflix to execute a marketing campaign that would dominate the cultural conversation. They delivered spectacularly. The promotional push for Season 3 exceeded anything Netflix had done for any property. Giant posters appeared in Times Square. The cast toured globally, appearing on every major talk show. Netflix partnered with brands and retailers to create Stranger Things merchandise lines. They transformed the show's release into a cultural event that extended far beyond the platform itself. The strategy worked. When Season 3 premiered on July 4th, 2019, the response was immediate and overwhelming. 40.7 million household accounts streamed at least one episode in the first 4 days. This was not simply impressive, it was record-shattering. The largest debut for any Netflix original to that point. But the metrics told only part of the story. What mattered more was the conversation. Social media exploded with reactions, theories, and emotional responses. The final scene, Hopper's letter to 11, read in voiceover as she prepared to leave. Hawkins became one of the most gifted and shared moments in television history. David Harbour's performance reduced millions to tears. And then there was the music. The Duffers had always understood music's power to evoke emotion and period authenticity. Season 3's soundtrack featured carefully selected 80s hits that enhanced key moments. But one song became a phenomenon within the phenomenon. Never Ending Story by Limahal, performed by Dustin and his girlfriend Susie in a moment of crisis, should not have worked. The scene arrives during the climactic battle sequence, interrupting the tension for what seems like comedic relief. Yet somehow, it became one of Season 3's most beloved moments. Sweet, funny, true to character, and emotionally satisfying in ways that transcended the absurdity of singing a cheesy 80s love song while the world hangs in balance. The scene went viral independently of the show itself. It was shared millions of times, covered by musicians, recreated by fans. It generated free publicity worth more than any advertising campaign. And it demonstrated the Duffers' instinct for emotional truth in that moment of crisis. Two teenagers who loved each other would absolutely sing their song, regardless of the stakes. These cultural moments had tangible economic consequences. Netflix's third-quarter subscriber numbers demolished analyst expectations. The platform added 6.8 million new subscribers globally, with Stranger Things cited as the primary driver. The stock price surged. Investors who had questioned Netflix's content strategy suddenly saw vindication. This success fundamentally altered Netflix's position in the streaming wars. Disney was preparing to launch Disney Plus in November 2019, with the full weight of Marvel, Star Wars, and Pixar content. Apple TV Plus was launching in the same window. The competitive landscape was intensifying, but Stranger Things had proven Netflix could generate cultural moments that rivaled anything traditional studios could produce. The Duffers now possessed maximum leverage. They could dictate terms for Season 4, knowing that Netflix literally could not afford to lose Stranger Things. The show had become too valuable not just as content, but as proof of Netflix's viability in an increasingly crowded market. The young cast members wielded similar power. Millie Bobby Brown had leveraged her fame into a film career, starring in Godzilla movies and the Enola Holmes franchise for Netflix. Finn Wolfhard was releasing music and taking film roles. The actors no longer needed Stranger Things for career viability. Stranger Things needed them. Yet there was mutual dependency here. The show remained their most visible platform. Its success elevated everything else they did, and there was genuine affection between cast members, between actors and creators. This was not purely transactional. These young people had grown up together, had shared extraordinary experiences. The bonds were real, even as the business calculations grew more complex. Netflix began negotiations for Season 4 from a position of both strength and vulnerability. Strength, because Season 3 had proven the show's continued commercial viability. Vulnerability, because everyone involved knew their leverage and would use it. The resulting deals for the Duffers, for the cast, for key crew members, represented some of the most expensive in television history. But Netflix paid willingly because the mathematics were clear. Stranger Things drove subscriptions worth hundreds of millions annually. It generated merchandising revenue, theme park deals, and licensing agreements that turned the show into a billion-dollar franchise. $15 million per episode looked expensive until you calculated the return on investment. The Duffers, flush with both creative validation and financial security, began planning Season 4 with an ambition that would have seemed insane during Season 1. They would expand the scope dramatically, splitting storylines across multiple locations, including California and Russia. They would introduce a new villain, Vecna, who would be more developed and terrifying than any previous threat, and they would supersize the episodes, making some nearly feature-length. This escalation reflected confidence, yes, but also awareness that Stranger Things was approaching its endgame. The young cast couldn't play teenagers forever. The mythology had been building to certain revelations. The Duffers had always envisioned 4 or 5 seasons, enough to tell the complete story without overstaying the welcome. Season 3 had represented peak power for everyone involved. The show had dominated the summer, demolished records, generated hundreds of millions in value, and proven beyond doubt that streaming could create cultural phenomena rivaling anything traditional television or film could produce. But peak power is, by definition, a moment rather than a state. What follows the peak is either managed decline or strategic conclusion. The Duffers would need to decide how many more seasons, how to end the story satisfyingly, how to preserve the show's legacy while everyone involved, cast, crew, creators, and platform, sought to maximize their returns. These were not merely creative questions. They were strategic calculations that would determine the futures of young actors, the trajectory of the Duffers' careers, and Netflix's position in the streaming wars. Season 3 had won the battle decisively, but the war continued, with new competitors entering the field constantly. As production prepared to begin on Season 4, an unexpected variable entered the equation, one that would disrupt every plan, force massive delays, and paradoxically strengthen the show's ultimate position. But no one in the summer of 2019 could have predicted a global pandemic. They were celebrating victory, counting their winnings, planning their next moves with the confidence that comes from having dominated completely. The mall stood as testament to their success, a massive set that had cost millions, generated millions more in product placement, and provided the backdrop for some of television's most memorable sequences. When filming wrapped and the set was eventually dismantled, it left behind something more permanent, proof that television in the streaming era could command resources and attention once reserved for cinema alone. Stranger Things had reached its apex. Everyone involved had maximized their leverage. The show had become more than entertainment. It had become an economic engine, a cultural force, and a weapon that Netflix wielded with precision against increasingly desperate competitors. The peak had been reached. The power was consolidated. Now came the challenge of maintaining altitude while preparing for the inevitable descent, or, if the Duffers played their final cards correctly, executing a perfect landing that would preserve the show's legacy and set up the next phase of the franchise. The summer of 2019 belonged to Stranger Things. What came next would depend on choices not yet made, on negotiations not yet completed, on external forces beyond anyone's control. But in that moment of triumph, with records shattered and competitors demoralized, one thing was certain. The Duffer Brothers' gamble in that conference room 4 years earlier had paid off beyond anyone's wildest calculations. They had changed television. They had enriched themselves and everyone involved. And they had proven that, in the attention economy, genuine quality combined with strategic timing remains the ultimate competitive advantage. The peak was magnificent. The view was spectacular. And though the descent was inevitable, the landing could still be perfect if everyone played their remaining cards with the same calculation and skill that had brought them to this height. In March of 2020, the world stopped. Production on. Season 4 of Stranger Things had begun in earnest, with sets constructed, scripts completed, and the cast assembled in Atlanta. The Duffers had planned their most ambitious season yet. Storylines spanning multiple continents, elaborate action sequences, a new villain that would require extensive prosthetics and visual effects. Everything was in motion. And then it wasn't. The COVID-19 pandemic forced productions worldwide to halt. Insurance companies refused coverage. Safety protocols didn't exist. No one knew when filming could resume or under what conditions. For most productions, this represented catastrophe budgets hemorrhaging, momentum lost, carefully coordinated schedules shattered. But for Stranger Things, the pandemic became something unexpected, a strategic advantage. Consider what happens when an entire industry stops simultaneously. Competition freezes. Every show faces the same delays, the same uncertainties, the same scramble to adapt. In such an environment, whoever adapts most effectively gains disproportionate advantage. And crucially, the delay provided cover for negotiations that would have sparked controversy in normal times. The young cast of Stranger Things had been approaching a critical inflection point. Finn Wolfhard, Millie Bobby Brown, Gaten Matarazzo, Caleb McLaughlin, Noah Schnapp, and Sadie Sink were no longer children. They were young adults with substantial earning power, with representatives who understood precisely how much value their clients generated. Their existing contracts negotiated when they were unknowns had been renegotiated upward after season 2 and 3, but still didn't reflect their true market value. The pandemic shutdown gave everyone breathing room to complete what would normally be contentious negotiations. With production halted indefinitely, there was no urgency, no pressure of imminent filming deadlines. Discussions could proceed methodically, and critically, the delays affected all, productions equally, which meant the young actors couldn't leverage competing offers as effectively. This paradoxically strengthened Netflix's position while allowing them to be generous. The salary increases were substantial, but without the bidding wars that might have occurred in normal circumstances. Millie Bobby Brown's negotiations proved particularly complex. By 2020, she had become more than the star of Stranger Things. She had built a multimedia empire. Her Enola Holmes film for Netflix had been a substantial success. She had endorsement deals worth millions. She was producing content through her own company. Brown's representatives wanted more than salary increases. They wanted equity participation in future Stranger Things projects, back-end points, and producer credits that reflected her creative input. These negotiations revealed something profound about how the economics of streaming content had evolved. In traditional television, stars might earn millions per episode, but the studio retained ownership of the intellectual property. Netflix's model was more flexible and more complex. They could offer back-end participation because they controlled the entire value chain, from production through distribution. Brown's team understood this and leveraged it effectively. The exact terms remained confidential, but industry observers estimated Brown's deal for Season 4 included salary in the mid-six figures per episode, plus participation in merchandising and potential spin-offs. She had transformed from child actor to business entity, and her deal reflected that evolution. But Brown's situation highlighted a larger strategic reality for Netflix. The streaming wars had intensified during the pandemic. Disney Plus had launched and grown explosively. HBO Max was gaining subscribers. Apple TV Plus was spending billions on original content. In this environment, Netflix needed to secure not just the show, but the entire ecosystem around it. The Duffers received their own transformative deal during the shutdown. Netflix offered them an overall agreement worth a reported 9 figures, somewhere between $100 and $200 million, that secured exclusive rights to any content they created over multiple years. This wasn't simply about Stranger Things. Netflix was betting on the Duffers as long-term franchise architects who could create and oversee multiple series set in the Stranger Things universe or entirely new properties. This represented Netflix's evolution from content distributor to full-fledged studio. They were building long-term relationships with proven creators, locking in talent before competitors could poach them, and positioning themselves to develop cinematic universes that could sustain subscriber growth for decades. The pandemic also forced the Duffers to reconceive certain elements of Season 4. International travel became complicated, then impossible. Locations that had been scouted became inaccessible. The production timeline, originally ambitious, became absurd. But rather than compromise their vision, the Duffers made a strategic decision. They would embrace the delay and use the additional time to enhance rather than reduce their ambitions. Season 4's episodes grew longer, some approaching feature length. What had been planned as tight action sequences expanded into elaborate set pieces. The show that had begun with a modest budget and 8 tidy episodes had evolved into something that resembled a film series more than traditional television. This decision had financial implications. Longer episodes cost more to produce, but they also inflated a metric Netflix cared deeply about: total hours viewed. In the streaming wars, platforms competed not just for subscribers but for viewing time. An episode that ran 90 minutes generated more impressive statistics than one that ran 45, even if the content was equivalent. The Duffers understood this, and structured Season 4 accordingly. But there was creative justification as well. The mythology they had been building for 3 seasons was reaching its climax. The story demanded space to breathe, to develop, to earn its emotional beats. Rushing would have sacrificed quality. The pandemic's forced delay became permission to do things properly. Production resumed in September of 2020 under unprecedented safety protocols. The cost of these protocols, constant testing, isolated production bubbles, enhanced cleaning, reduced crew sizes, added millions to the budget. But Netflix absorbed these costs without complaint because delay was more expensive than safety measures. Every month Stranger Things remained in production rather than on the platform represented lost subscriber value. The young cast returned to Atlanta changed by more than age. They had spent months in lockdown, had experienced the pandemic's isolation like everyone else, had grown in ways both visible and invisible. This maturation showed on screen. Their performances in Season 4 carried a weight and depth that reflected both improved craft and lived experience. Consider what the 3-year gap between Seasons 3 and 4 actually accomplished. In traditional television's annual model, such a delay would be catastrophic. Audiences would move on. Cultural relevance would fade. But streaming's economics worked differently. Stranger Things remained available on Netflix throughout the pandemic. New viewers discovered it constantly. The delay built anticipation rather than destroying it. Social media kept the show alive in the cultural conversation. Fan theories about Hopper's survival proliferated. Speculation about Season 4's plot reached fever pitch. The Duffers dropped occasional hints and teaser trailers that generated millions of views. The absence made fans hungrier, more invested, more certain to watch immediately upon release. This patience, allowing the show to develop properly rather than rushing to meet quarterly targets, represented a luxury unique to Netflix's business model. Traditional networks lived or died by annual schedules and advertising revenues. Netflix could take the long view because their economics were based on subscriber retention rather than advertising slots. But there were risks. The young cast was aging. Every month of delay meant they looked less like teenagers. Eventually, the show would need to acknowledge that these characters had grown up. The Duffers had planned for this, setting Season 4 in 1986, a full year after Season 3. This time jump accommodated the actors' natural aging while maintaining narrative continuity. The extended production timeline also allowed unprecedented attention to detail. The new villain, Vecna, played by Jamie Campbell Bower, required extensive prosthetics that took hours to apply. The design evolved through multiple iterations, with the extra time allowing refinements that made the character more terrifying and memorable. Similarly, the visual effects sequences received additional polish. What had been weeks of post-production on earlier seasons became months. Netflix's competitors watched these developments with a mixture of envy and concern. They could see that Stranger Things would return more ambitious and polished than ever. But they also noted the costs, both financial and temporal. Could they afford to give their own shows such lavish resources and extended timelines? The answer for most was no, which meant Stranger Things would emerge from the pandemic in an even stronger competitive position. The delay also allowed the Duffers to perfect their strategy for Season 4's release. Rather than dropping all episodes at once, they announced a split release, a first volume in May 2022, a second volume in July. This decision was calculated to maximize both viewing metrics and cultural conversation. A single release generated one spike in attention. A split release generated two separate media cycles, maintaining Stranger Things in the cultural conversation across 2 months. It also prevented competitors from gaining foothold during the critical summer window, and it created two separate opportunities for social media explosions, for fan theories to develop and evolve, for the show to dominate streaming rankings twice rather than once. But the split release had another purpose. It allowed Netflix to respond to viewer reactions between volumes. If certain plot threads resonated particularly well in Volume 1, marketing for Volume 2 could emphasize those elements. If criticisms emerged, the Duffers could acknowledge them in interviews and frame Volume 2 as addressing concerns. The traditional model of releasing complete seasons offered no such flexibility. As production wrapped in late 2021, the pieces were in position. The cast had negotiated deals that reflected their value. The Duffers had secured creative and financial futures. Netflix had locked down the franchise for future expansion. The episodes themselves exceeded previous seasons in scope, ambition, and budget. The 3-year gap forced by circumstances beyond anyone's control had paradoxically strengthened every participant's position. The delay had provided time for thorough negotiations without the pressure of imminent deadlines. It had allowed the show to dominate conversation through strategic teasing rather than disappearing from view. It had given the cast time to age naturally rather than straining believability, and it had built anticipation to unprecedented levels. In retrospect, the pandemic delay might have been the best thing that could have happened to Stranger Things' long-term prospects. It forced patience when the natural impulse would have been to rush. It provided cover for difficult negotiations. It allowed quality to trump speed, and it demonstrated that Stranger Things could sustain extended absences, that the show's cultural footprint was permanent enough to survive years between seasons. This realization had implications for the show's endgame strategy. If Stranger Things could thrive despite or because of lengthy gaps, then the Duffers could take their time concluding the series properly. There was no need to rush Season 5. They could plan deliberately, ensure quality, and deliver a finale that satisfied both the narrative they had constructed and the commercial interests of everyone involved. The pandemic had been catastrophic for the world, for the entertainment industry, for millions of people whose lives were upended or destroyed. But for Stranger Things specifically, the forced pause became an opportunity. Everyone emerged from negotiations with better deals. The show emerged from production with higher quality, and Netflix emerged from the delay with strengthened control over one of its most valuable properties. As May 2022 approached the scheduled release date for Season 4, Volume 1 anticipation reached levels that exceeded even Season 3's massive premiere. The 3-year wait had done its work. Fans were desperate for resolution. Critics were curious whether the show could maintain quality. Investors were watching to see if Netflix's patience would pay off. The streaming wars had intensified during those 3 years. Disney Plus had become a formidable competitor. HBO Max had consolidated Warner Brothers' vast library. Paramount Plus and Peacock had entered the fray. Amazon had spent billions on the Lord of the Rings series. Apple TV Plus had won Best Picture with Coda. The landscape was more competitive than ever. Into this environment, Stranger Things would return bigger, longer, more expensive, and more ambitious than before. The pandemic delay had given it time to become something more than television. It was an event, a cultural moment, a demonstration of Netflix's continued relevance in an increasingly crowded market. The patience had been forced by circumstance, but the Duffers, the cast, and Netflix had transformed that patience into leverage. They had used the delay to strengthen positions, improve content, and build anticipation. What could have been disaster became advantage. Now came the moment of truth. Would the 3-year wait prove worthwhile? Would audiences return in force? Would the supersized episodes justify their inflated budgets? Would the split release strategy work as planned? The answers would arrive in May, but the foundation had been carefully laid. The pandemic had tested everyone involved. They had emerged stronger, richer, and more strategically positioned than before the world stopped. Sometimes, in nature and in business, the pause before the strike is what makes the strike devastating. Stranger Things had paused. Now it would strike with all the force that 3 years of anticipation, negotiation, and preparation could provide. May 27th, 2022. The wait was over. At midnight Pacific time, 7 episodes of Stranger Things Season 4 Volume 1 appeared on Netflix's platform. Within hours, the numbers began rolling in, not merely impressive, but record-annihilating. The 3-year anticipation, the strategic patience, the pandemic-forged delays, all of it had built to this moment, and the response exceeded every projection. But numbers alone cannot capture what Season 4 represented. This was television that had transcended its medium's traditional constraints. The runtime told part of the story. The season's 9 episodes totaled nearly 13 hours. 2 episodes exceeded 90 minutes. The finale approached feature length at 2.5 hours. This was no longer television in any conventional sense. It was a film series released through a streaming platform, structured for maximum impact and maximum viewing metrics. Consider the strategic brilliance of this approach. Netflix competed not just for subscribers but for viewing time. In investor presentations, they highlighted total hours viewed as a key metric demonstrating engagement and value. A 13-hour season generated vastly more impressive statistics than an 8-hour season, even if both were equally compelling. The Duffers had structured Season 4 to maximize this metric while maintaining narrative justification for the extended runtime. But runtime meant nothing if the content didn't deliver, and Season 4 delivered something remarkable. It was both the show's most ambitious season and, according to many critics and fans, its best. The Duffers had learned from every previous season's successes and failures. They maintained Season 3's propulsive pacing while avoiding Season 2's occasional sluggishness. They split the ensemble across multiple locations: Hawkins, California, Russia, creating parallel storylines that would eventually converge. And they introduced Vecna, a villain more developed and terrifying than any previous threat. Vecna represented a calculated evolution of the show's horror elements. Previous seasons had featured monsters, the Demogorgon, the Mind Flayer, that were fundamentally alien, unknowable. Vecna was different. He had been human once, had a backstory that connected to Eleven's origins, possessed intelligence and malevolence that made him personal rather than abstract. He didn't just threaten Hawkins, he targeted specific individuals, exploiting their guilt and trauma. This psychological horror proved more effective than pure spectacle. When Vecna claimed his first victim, Chrissy Cunningham, a cheerleader struggling with an eating disorder and an abusive home, the scene was genuinely disturbing. Her bones breaking, her eyes collapsing. The graphic violence of her death shocked audiences accustomed to the show's generally restrained approach to gore. But the Duffers understood that horror works best when audiences care about the victims. They spent time establishing Chrissy as a person, showing her vulnerability, her desperate search for help from Eddie Munson, the school's drug dealer, and Dungeons and Dragons enthusiast. Her death mattered because we had been given reason to care about her life. Eddie Munson himself represented another strategic character introduction. Played by Joseph Quinn, Eddie was designed to fill the Steve Harrington role, the character who seems like a stereotype but reveals unexpected depth. Eddie's passion for heavy metal and tabletop gaming, his theatrical personality, his fierce loyalty to his friends, all of it made him immediately beloved by fans. The Duffers knew they were creating someone audiences would love, and they knew they would kill him. This was calculation at its most precise. Eddie's death in the season finale, playing Master of Puppets by Metallica on his guitar to distract Demobats while his friends fought, Vecna provided the emotional gut punch the season needed. It proved stakes were real, that even beloved characters could die heroically, and it guaranteed that Season 4 would be remembered for more than just spectacle. But perhaps the most strategic element of Season 4 involved music. The Duffers had always understood music's power, but they executed something extraordinary with Kate Bush's Running Up That Hill. The song, originally released in 1985, became the mechanism through which Max escaped Vecna's grasp. Her friends discovered that music could reach people trapped in Vecna's visions, pulling them back from death. In the season's most iconic scene, Lucas, Dustin, and Steve frantically searched through Max's Walkman while she slowly rose into the air, her bones beginning to crack. They found her tape, they pressed play, and Kate Bush's ethereal voice broke through Vecna's hold. The sequence was masterfully crafted. The editing, the performance, the way Max ran toward the portal between Vecna's realm and reality, while memories of her friends played around her. It was emotional, suspenseful, and visually stunning, and it became one of the most watched and shared sequences in television history. But what happened next transcended entertainment. Running Up That Hill exploded on streaming platforms. The song, 37 years old, reached #1 in dozens of countries. It introduced Kate Bush to an entirely new generation. Spotify reported unprecedented streaming numbers. The song's resurgence generated hundreds of millions in revenue and gave Bush her biggest hit since the 1980s. This created a fascinating economic feedback loop. The Duffers had paid substantial licensing fees to use the song rights. Negotiations had taken months and required personal appeals to Bush herself, who was notoriously selective about licensing her music. But the song's subsequent success generated value that exceeded anything Netflix or the Duffers had anticipated. It created free publicity worth tens of millions. It demonstrated Stranger Things' cultural power. The show could resurrect decades-old music and make it relevant again. More strategically, it created data partnerships. Spotify and other streaming platforms suddenly had enormous incentive to promote Stranger Things because the show drove massive traffic to their services. This cross-platform synergy represented the future of content marketing, multiple companies benefiting from a single cultural moment, creating incentives for mutual promotion. The split release strategy proved equally calculated. Volume 1 dropped on May 27th. Volume 2 followed on July 1st. This 5-week gap generated exactly what Netflix intended: sustained conversation, 2 separate media cycles, and prevention of competitor content from gaining foothold during the critical summer window. Between volumes, social media exploded with theories about how the season would conclude. Would Max survive her injuries? Would Eleven regain her powers permanently? What was Vecna's endgame? The Duffers had structured Volume 1's ending Max in a coma, Hawkins fractured by earthquakes that were actually rifts between dimensions to create maximum cliffhanger tension. This also allowed strategic marketing adjustments. Netflix watched the Volume 1 response closely. They noted which characters resonated most strongly, which plot threads generated the most discussion, which moments went most viral. The Volume 2 marketing campaign emphasized these elements, ensuring maximum alignment between content and audience interest. When Volume 2 premiered on July 1st, the response was even larger than Volume 1. The finale at 2 hours and 19 minutes was treated as an event film rather than a television episode. Viewing parties proliferated, social media conversation reached unprecedented levels, and the metrics shattered all previous Netflix records. Within 28 days of Volume 2's release, Season 4 had generated 1.15 billion hours viewed. To put this in perspective, this was more than double any previous Netflix season. It was the kind of viewership that major film studios craved for blockbuster releases, and it demonstrated that Stranger Things had not simply maintained its audience during the 3-year gap, and it had expanded it dramatically, but the season's success went beyond numbers. It had re-established Stranger Things as the dominant force in streaming content. During the 2-month Season 4 occupied the cultural conversation, competitors struggled to gain attention. HBO's House of the Dragon wouldn't premiere until August. Amazon's Rings of Power wouldn't arrive until September. Disney Plus had nothing that could compete. Stranger Things owned the summer completely. This dominance had strategic implications for everyone involved. The Duffers, already secured with their overall deal, found their negotiating position for Season 5 even stronger. They could dictate terms, extended production timelines, increased budgets, complete creative autonomy, knowing Netflix had no leverage to refuse. Season 4 had proven the show could deliver unprecedented value even after multi-year gaps. The young cast members, now in their early 20s, had also strengthened their positions. Millie Bobby Brown's performance in Season 4 reminded everyone why she was the show's centerpiece. Her portrayal of Eleven confronting her traumatic past, regaining her powers through painful memory excavation, and facing Vecna in the climactic battle showcased acting ability that had matured considerably since Season 1. But Brown's representatives understood her value extended beyond Stranger Things. The Enola Holmes sequel had been greenlit. She was producing multiple projects. Fashion and beauty endorsements continued to multiply. Stranger Things remained important to her brand, but it was no longer her only asset. This gave her tremendous flexibility. In Season 5 negotiations, she could afford to walk away if terms weren't acceptable, which paradoxically ensured terms would be acceptable. The other young actors faced similar calculations. Finn Wolfhard had his music career and film roles. Caleb McLaughlin was pursuing dramatic roles that showcased his range. Gaten Matarazzo had Broadway ambitions. None of them needed Stranger Things for financial security anymore, but all of them recognized the show's importance to their profiles and the genuine relationships they had built over 7 years of working together. Netflix approached Season 5 negotiations understanding these dynamics. They needed to keep the cast happy and intact. They needed to give the Duffers everything required to conclude the story properly. And they needed Season 5 to be worth the wait, to serve as a satisfying conclusion that would preserve Stranger Things' legacy rather than tarnish it. The economic ecosystem the show had created was staggering. Direct revenue from subscriptions driven by Stranger Things ran into hundreds of millions annually. Merchandise licensing generated additional hundreds of millions. The Netflix theme park attraction in partnership with Universal Studios created ongoing revenue streams. Video games, books, comics, and other ancillary products extended the brand into every possible medium. But perhaps most valuable was what Stranger Things represented in Netflix's overall positioning. The show proved streaming could generate cultural moments rivaling theatrical releases. It demonstrated that algorithmic data could inform rather than dictate creative decisions. It provided a template for limited series storytelling that had defined quality and commercial success. Industry observers noted that post-Stranger Things, Netflix's approach to prestige content had evolved. They gave creators more autonomy, longer production timelines, and larger budgets when justified. They embraced split releases and strategic scheduling. They understood that sustainable success required treating top-tier talent as partners rather than contractors. This evolution owed much to what the Duffers had proven, that creators who truly understood their vision could deliver extraordinary value if given resources and freedom. Netflix's willingness to let the Duffers supersede Season 4, to embrace the pandemic delays, to support the split release, all of it demonstrated trust that had been earned through consistent delivery. As Summer 22 progressed, and Season 4's dominance became undeniable, attention turned to the endgame. The Duffers confirmed what many had suspected. Season 5 would be the final season. They had always envisioned a 4 to 5 season arc. The story was reaching its natural conclusion. Will, now deeply connected to Vecna and the Upside Down, would be central to the final conflict. 11 would face her ultimate test. Hawkins would have its final battle. This announcement was strategically timed. By confirming the end was near, the Duffers created urgency. Season 5 would be the last chance to experience Stranger Things as a communal event. This would drive viewership to unprecedented levels. It would also preserve the show's legacy by ending at a high point rather than declining into irrelevance. The decision to end after 5 seasons reflected lessons learned from other major series. Game of Thrones had damaged its legacy with a controversial final season. Lost had lost narrative coherence. Dexter had overstayed its welcome. The Duffers understood that knowing when to end was as important as knowing how to begin. Netflix accepted this decision despite the financial pain of losing such a valuable property. But they had secured something equally important. The Duffers' overall deal included rights to develop spin-offs and related projects. Stranger Things as a specific show might end, but Stranger Things as a franchise could continue indefinitely. This franchise thinking represented the ultimate strategic evolution. The show itself was finite, but the world it had created, the mythology it had established, could sustain multiple series. The Duffers could explore different time periods, different locations, different characters all existing within the Stranger Things universe. This was the Marvel model applied to horror-tinged nostalgia, and it promised years of additional content. Season 4 had accomplished everything Netflix needed. It had shattered records. It had dominated the cultural conversation. It had proven Stranger Things could survive extended gaps. And it had positioned Season 5 as a cultural event that would conclude one of streaming's defining series. The scale and spectacle of Season 4, its runtime, its budget, its ambition, had established a new benchmark for what streaming content could achieve. Traditional television couldn't match these resources. Film studios struggled to generate the equivalent cultural conversation. Stranger Things had become something unique, too big for television, too serialized for cinema, perfectly suited for streaming's economics and global reach. As production prepared to begin on Season 5, scheduled for sometime in 2023 or 2024, with release likely in late 2024, everyone involved understood the stakes. This would be the final chapter. The conclusion would need to satisfy millions of devoted fans, honor the 7-year journey, provide emotional catharsis, and preserve the show's legacy. But there was confidence born of experience. The Duffers had proven they could deliver under pressure. The cast had matured into skilled performers capable of carrying complex material. Netflix had demonstrated willingness to provide whatever resources the finale required. Season 4 had been the show's triumph of scale and spectacle. It had proven that bigger could be better when backed by genuine quality. It had demonstrated dominance so complete that competitors could only watch and wonder how to replicate it. Now came the final act. The ultimate battle, the conclusion to a story that had begun with a child disappearing in the woods and had grown into one of entertainment's defining sagas. The dominance was established. The spectacle had dazzled. Now came the responsibility of ending well, of sticking the landing, of leaving audiences satisfied rather than disappointed, of concluding a cultural phenomenon in a way that honored both the story and the millions who had invested in it, emotionally. Season 4 had shown what Stranger Things could achieve at its peak. Season 5 would show whether it could end with the same excellence that had defined its rise. There is a moment in every great enterprise when the architects must decide when to end. The Duffer Brothers faced this decision not from weakness, but from strength. Season 4 had delivered unprecedented success. Season 5 could almost certainly replicate those numbers. The young cast, though aging, could plausibly continue. Netflix would pay virtually any price to extend the franchise. Every economic incentive pointed toward continuation, and yet the Duffers chose to end. This decision to conclude Stranger Things after 5 seasons represented the ultimate power play precisely because it was a choice rather than a necessity. Consider what this meant. The brothers were walking away from guaranteed wealth, from years of additional employment, from the security that comes with managing a proven success. They were betting that ending at the peak would create more long-term value than extracting every possible season. History proved them correct to be cautious. The entertainment landscape was littered with series that had overstayed their welcome. Game of Thrones' final season had become a cultural cautionary tale about how quickly beloved properties could damage their legacies. Lost had collapsed under the weight of its own mythology. The Walking Dead had shambled on, long past its creative vitality. Audiences were becoming more sophisticated about recognizing when shows continued purely for profit rather than narrative necessity. The Duffers understood something profound. In the attention economy, legacy value can exceed short-term revenue. A series remembered as excellent throughout its run becomes evergreen content, perpetually valuable, constantly attracting new viewers, maintaining cultural relevance across decades. A series that declines in quality becomes a cautionary tale, its later seasons actively harming the earlier one's reputation. By ending after 5 seasons, the Duffers preserved what they had created. Season 5 would arrive with the weight of being the final chapter. Audiences would watch knowing this was their last chance to experience Stranger Things as a communal event. Critics would evaluate it as a complete work rather than an ongoing serial, and most importantly, the story could conclude on the Duffers' terms rather than stumbling toward cancellation or irrelevance. But ending the show did not mean ending the franchise. The overall deal the Duffers had negotiated with Netflix included rights to develop spin-offs, prequels, and related projects within the Stranger Things universe. This was strategic brilliance. They would conclude the main narrative while opening pathways for future content that wouldn't be burdened by the original cast's aging or the need to continually escalate stakes beyond believability. The economic ecosystem Stranger Things had created would persist long after the final episode. The show had launched careers that would generate downstream revenue for decades. Millie Bobby Brown, Finn Wolfhard, and the other young actors would command substantial salaries in future projects, with Stranger Things forever attached to their professional identities. The Duffers themselves had established reputations as showrunners who could deliver both quality and commercial success, ensuring they would have opportunities across the industry. Netflix's credentials with prestige talent had been established partly through Stranger Things. The platform had proven it could nurture a property from concept through conclusion without the interference that plagued traditional studios. This reputation would help them attract the next generation of creative talent, the next potential phenomenon waiting to be discovered. The template Stranger Things provided limited-run series with clear narrative endpoints, substantial budgets, creator autonomy, strategic release timing, had become the model for prestige streaming content. Other platforms studied what Netflix and the Duffers had accomplished and attempted to replicate it. Some succeeded, many failed, but the attempt itself validated the approach. Perhaps most significantly, Stranger Things had proven that, in the streaming era, genuine quality remained the ultimate competitive advantage. No amount of algorithmic optimization could replace the emotional resonance of well-crafted characters and compelling storytelling. No marketing budget could manufacture the organic cultural conversation that arose from content that truly connected with audiences. The legacy extended beyond entertainment industry mechanics. Stranger Things had demonstrated that nostalgia, when deployed strategically and backed by substance, could serve as a bridge between generations. Parents who had grown up in the 80s watched alongside children discovering that decade for the first time. The show created shared cultural reference points in an increasingly fragmented media landscape. It had also normalized representation in mainstream content. Robin's coming out, Lucas and Caleb McLaughlin's navigation of racial dynamics in 80s suburbia, Will's carefully developed journey toward self-acceptance. These elements were integrated naturally rather than performatively, proving that inclusive storytelling strengthened rather than compromised commercial appeal. As Hawkins prepared for its final battle, as Will faced his ultimate connection to the Upside Down, as Eleven confronted whatever conclusion the Duffers had crafted for her journey, the strategic victory was already complete. Stranger Things had transformed Netflix from content distributor to content powerhouse. It had enriched everyone involved, not just financially but professionally and creatively, and it had proven that in an attention economy drowning in content, quality remained rare and therefore valuable. The pitch made in 2015 had paid off beyond anyone's imagination. The power plays had been executed flawlessly. The viral moments had been organic yet strategically enabled. The expansion had been managed without losing the core of what made the show special. The patience during the pandemic had been rewarded. The dominance through scale and spectacle had been absolute. Now came the conclusion, the final test of whether the Duffers could end as brilliantly as they had begun. But regardless of Season 5's specific execution, the larger victory was secure. Stranger Things had changed television. It had redefined what streaming content could accomplish, and it had demonstrated that creators with clear vision, platforms willing to trust them, and audiences hungry for genuine quality could together create something that transcended commerce to become culture. The Upside Down would close. Hawkins would survive or fall. The characters audiences had loved for years would face their final challenges. But the legacy, the proof that excellence still mattered, that strategic calculation combined with creative passion could reshape industries, that stories well told could unite millions across the world, that legacy was already secure. Stranger Things had begun as a gamble. It ended as a triumph. And in between, it had shown that the future of entertainment belonged not to those with the biggest budgets or the most sophisticated algorithms, but to those who understood the enduring truth that great stories, beautifully told, remain humanity's most powerful technology for connection and meaning. The monsters had been faced. The battles had been won. The strategic victory was complete. Now came only the final chapter of a story that had already secured its place in the history of how we tell stories to each other in the digital age.